Hello guys and welcome to another video. In this video we'll be checking the RTX 3080 10GB version to see if it's still viable in Q1 2023. In 2020 this card was released and marketed as a 4K capable card. Today we'll be checking the performance of this card at 1440p and 1080p. I can assure you that this card now is not a 4K capable card. The games that we'll be checking are all of them released in 2023 Q1. I'll be showing the settings used for each game, but be sure that I'm using max settings without any upscale. So let's check the performance of a high-end card from 2020 in 2023. So first I will start with showing you the settings that I have in NVIDIA control panel. I use these settings for all the games here that are tested. Also I have the card undervolted to 0.9 volts and 1965 clock speed. Now let's move to the first game that I tested. Forspoken. These are the settings used for testing the game. These settings were used for 1080p and 1440p runs. I must confess that the game performed well on this graphic card. On 1080p we have like a 93 frames per second average, and on 1440p 67. Average lows I could not put because the internal benchmark doesn't have information regarding that. Keep in mind what you are seeing here is with recording, so I'm losing like 10%. Let's move to another game. These are the settings used for Hogwarts Legacy. I'm using max settings on 1080p and 1440p. Keep in mind that this game at 1440p with everything maxed out has issues running on cards with 8GB of video RAM. Some things to point out. Sometimes I saw some texture disappearing or reappearing on this card. In the first run I had more stutters than in the second and third run. The game is quite unoptimized. As you can see, the GPU usage is around 80% in areas. As you can be seen on the screen, we have at 1080p an average of 71.1 and 35.4 when it comes to the 1% lows, and at 1440p you have 51.7 and 23.2 when it comes to 1% lows. One thing to point out, I had more stutters at 1440p than at 1080p, but not by much. On my 4080 I have less stutters than at 1080p, but I have some as well. Moving on to The Last of Us Part 1. This game requires 12GB of VRAM for 1440p max settings. When lowering the resolution to 1080p, I saw that it requires 1GB less. So let's see if we can handle the game. The best advice that I can give is let the game compile shaders and afterwards set the settings and play the game. I was expecting more stutters, but I didn't have that many. Compared to Hogwarts Legacy, this is amazing. And the performance is quite good, as you can see in the screen. 95.7 and 70.3, and the 1% lows are quite good as well. I played around 1 hour on the 3080 and I didn't have any issues. No crashes, no texture issues, nothing. But I would expect it to crash as on my 4080. Now let's move to Resident Evil. This game at 1440p max settings requires more than 12GB of video RAM. The same applies as well for 1080p. Let's see if we can run the game. Like Last of Us Part 1, this game requires a pretty good CPU. As we can see, the performance in the game is quite good. Around 100 FPS is really good. The GPU can produce high frame rates in this area, but we have an issue. Unfortunately, we have a VRAM issue. The game crashes on 10GB with everything maxed out. This applies to 1080p as well, and there is no way to avoid it. It doesn't crash your computer, but crashes the game. I wanted to see if I enable rebar, things will change, but unfortunately, no. 1080p, 1440p max settings with 10GB of VRAM doesn't work. I'm not sure if 12GB is enough for this game. Now let's move to the last game that I'm going to show you the settings. Long Fallen Dynasty. This game has an issue. The max FPS is 120. Even if I have this thing disabled, I cannot overcome that. So at 1080p we have a limitation, and that is 120 FPS. This game runs quite well. We don't have stutters, we have good frame rates on 1080p and 1440p, but the game doesn't look that good. I mean, compared to the previous game that we saw, this is by far the worst. Most likely the averages for the 1080p will be a lot higher if we didn't have the limitation of 120 FPS. Now let's look at the overall results. I have a few more games to show you in the table. First, Dead Space performs quite well on this card. 1080p and 1440p we have good frame rates. The game starters as usual, the same as on my 4080. We do have a good performance uplift from moving down to 1080p from 1440p. On Oolong, I am unable to remove the 120 FPS cap. The averages for the 1080 would have been a lot higher. Moving on to Returnal, I was expecting it to perform worse, but it seems that it performs quite well on a 3080 with 10GB. When it comes to Resident Evil, we have 0 FPS. The game crashed at 1080p and 1440p with max settings. Moving on to The Last of Us, I was expecting it to perform worse. Reading the horror stories on the internet, I was expecting it to crash a lot. When it comes to Hogwarts Legacy and Hogsmeade, the performance is as expected. We do have starters, the same as on my 4080. Forspoken is the pleasant surprise. The game runs quite well on 3080. Now let's look at the averages from all the games at 1080p and 1440p. The averages that you see here takes into account that Resident Evil crashed. So at 1440p we have an average of 65.4 and 42.37 when it comes to the 1% lows. If Resident Evil 4 wouldn't have crashed at 1080p, we would have had better averages and probably will be around 100 FPS or even more. So is the 3080 10GB version still a capable card? The answer yes and no. The problem is its VRAM. The 12GB version is better suited to handle games in 2023. Most likely it will run everything's max settings at 1440p. I still have some doubts when it comes to Resident Evil, but I think it will run. 10GB is not enough. 12 could be. Why I'm saying this is because on PlayStation 5 and Xbox we have 16GB of available memory. Games tend to use around 10-12 of it, and on console we don't have extreme textures. So imagine a game that uses high textures and you port it to PC and you have extreme option available, it will use more than what it requires on PS5 or Xbox. Simply put, a game that uses on consoles 11GB of VRAM, on PC it will use 13 with extreme settings or even more. Let's check the options we have to upgrade from a 3080. From AMD, to see an improvement in performance, we have only the 7900 XT and the XTX version. Both have more than enough memory for the years to come. Probably I will go with the XTX version because the increase in performance is more meaningful than coming to a 7900 XT. Prices are still ridiculous. Now let's look at 4070 Ti. From my point of view, probably this will be the worst, and only because of the VRAM. The performance increase will not be that big, more or less in line with going with the 7900 XT, but at least that one has more VRAM, and as we saw, most likely some games will require more VRAM than 12GB. If you plan to lower the settings, then it doesn't make sense to upgrade from a 3080. The obvious choice from a 3080 will be a 4080. It has more RAM than needed, and the performance is quite well. I know it doesn't have the VRAM of the 7900 XT, but that is not needed. I think 16GB for now is more than enough, and for the years to come. The issue is that to move from 3080 performance to something less than 4080 or the 7900 XTX doesn't make sense. The performance from a 3080 to 4070 or a 4070 Ti is too small. So between a 4080 and a 7900 XTX, I will go with the AMD version just because it's 200 euros less. And from the looks of it, this card will perform mostly the same in Unreal Engine 5 games as the 4080. If money is no object, then the obvious choice is 4090.